You ever notice how sometimes the tiniest decisions can change everything? Well, something exactly like that just happened in North American politics, and it's not coming from Canada. It's coming from the US. But the kicker? It's actually validating Canada's strategy, not undermining it. For months, Americans have been watching quietly as Canadian tourists started vanishing from border towns. Weekend trips that used to be packed with Canadians suddenly disappeared. Hotels, restaurants, and ferries that depended on these visitors began feeling the pinch. And now, Congress is finally admitting what Canadians already knew. When you push Canada, Canada responds. And it does so strategically. Let's start with the numbers because they tell a story most people overlook. In Maine, border crossings dropped nearly 20% in 2025 compared to the previous year. That's not a small hiccup. That's tens of thousands of people who used to bring cash into local businesses, hotels, cafes, ferries, all but gone. Even the Cat Ferry between Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, and Bar Harbor, Maine, reported a 20% drop in summer traffic. Local leaders like Yarmouth's mayor are blunt.
Democrats in the American Joint Economic Committee have released a report raising concerns about declining Canadian visitors due, they say, to President Donald Trump's actions. The report says the negative impacts of President Trump's tariff policies have been particularly stark in states along the U.S.-Canada border, which have many businesses that rely on short-term visits by Canadians. Like in Maine, where U.S. Customs and Border Protection is reporting a nearly 20% drop in border crossings in 2025 compared with the same time last year.
Canada is a small percentage of our overall visitors, but it has a disproportionate impact on some of these communities.
The Democrats in the committee also cited a decrease in passengers on the Cat Ferry between Yarmouth, Nova Scotia and Bar Harbor, Maine. Last July, it reported an almost 20% drop in business over the summer. Yarmouth's mayor says President Trump's policies have played a role.
98% of what's happening is a result of that. I think it's obvious here anyway.
But Mood hasn't noticed a dip in U.S. visitors coming to Yarmouth.
They came in droves.
And this isn't the first time a Democrat raised concerns about President Trump's trade policies impacting border states. Last June, Maine Governor Janet Mills visited New Brunswick Premier Susan Holt in an attempt to improve relations between her state and the province.
The small businesses whose families come from New Brunswick, whose families come from Quebec, those small businesses are the ones who are being hurt right now.
According to the report, last year Canadian tourism contributed $20.5 million to the U.S. economy and supported 140,000 jobs. Anna Mandan, Global News, Fredericton.
98% of what's happening is a result of U.S. policies, he said. Here's where things get interesting. This isn't just about tourism. It's about an entire economic relationship being rebalanced. Canada didn't lash out. It didn't respond with flashy headlines or dramatic threats. Instead, Canadians quietly made a choice: spend less in the U.S., invest more at home, and prioritize their own industries. The result? A shift that's now impossible to ignore. And now, it's official. The Canadian government has launched a sweeping Buy Canadian policy. Federal spending, everything from infrastructure projects to defense contracts, will now prioritize Canadian suppliers, materials, and workers. Steel, aluminum, wood. If it's available domestically, it must be used. And it's not limited to small contracts. This applies immediately to contracts over $25 million and will expand to contracts over $5 million by spring 2026. Here's the part most people miss. This isn't protectionism for the sake of nationalism. It's disciplined economic strategy. By making the government its own biggest customer, Canada is strengthening domestic industries, creating jobs, and building supply chains that don't rely on anyone else. This is about turning government spending into a tool for long-term growth, not short-term politics. Think about it this way. Donald Trump's trade policies were meant to pressure Canada to make the U.S. more competitive. But instead of weakening Canada, it unified the country. Canadians changed their behavior. They stopped taking weekend trips to the U.S., they slowed cross-border shopping, and they doubled down on local industries. And now, with Buy Canadian, that behavioral shift becomes a structural one. It's law, not just a trend. This is where Prime Minister Mark Carney's strategy becomes unmistakable. He didn't frame this as retaliation, he framed it as nation building. Canada isn't just reacting, it's creating the future it wants. And the irony is rich. The very pressure designed to harm Canada has accelerated a transformation that makes Canada stronger, more self-reliant, and less vulnerable to external shocks. From the reactions online to commentary in Washington, the message is clear. U.S. lawmakers are warning Trump that his policies are backfiring, but Canada has already moved past the warnings. It's now acting deliberately, using economic tools to strengthen domestic industries, preserve jobs, and make itself less dependent on U.S. spending. This is the power of strategy over emotion, discipline over escalation. And it's not symbolic. Every steel beam, every aluminum panel, every contract awarded to a Canadian company reinforces a bigger lesson. Canada can protect its economic interests without creating chaos. It can unify politically, socially, and economically in ways that shift long-standing relationships without confrontation. In my view, this is one of the clearest examples in recent history of how a country can turn external pressure into an internal advantage. Canada didn't panic. Canada didn't overreact. Canada invested in its own strength, and now the results are impossible to ignore, even in Washington. So here's the twist. The U.S. thought it could pressure Canada into compliance, but in reality, it accelerated Canada's independence. Canadians stopped assuming automatic access to U.S. markets, started prioritizing domestic industries, and formalized the idea of being their own strongest economic customer. The U.S. Congress sees the fallout. Canada is already building the future. This isn't just a policy shift, it's a statement. Canada will no longer subsidize its own economic vulnerability. When the federal government spends, it will now select Canadian suppliers by default. This policy spans every federal agency, crown corporation, and major investment project. The message is crystal clear. Canada stands together, strategically, and it's working. So when we talk about the impact of tariffs, trade wars, and economic pressure, this is exactly what success looks like. Not just surviving a crisis, but using it as a catalyst for long-term strength. Canada isn't just weathering a storm. It's reshaping the map entirely, redefining independence, and proving that unity, politically, economically, and socially, is its greatest asset. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing. I appreciate you.